Guys, hope you enjoyed the last video. Sorry about the noise, but welcome to Tokyo. It is extremely busy and ever so loud, so the noise in the videos might be a little bit. But I hope you liked that reading video where I was at Tokyo Disneyland, and in this video, it's a gooder. But you'll have to stay tuned. So yeah, catch you in the warp. Well, my idea for recording the video inside of the Warhammer Cafe, if you guys can see it, it's just right there. We'll zoom in. It didn't plan out as I'd hoped. They said no filming with inside the store, so we're gonna do this a little bit differently. We're gonna sit outside of another place. If it gets loud, I'm sorry. If it's awkward, I'm sorry, but not really caring. Shapes fell silent from the sky. Patches of black were hard to make out in the greater darkness that had consumed everything. As the shadows landed somewhere over the horizon, they made up a deep grumbling noises, like distant thunder. Tharo was crouching on an embankment at the edge of the abandoned transitway, staring out into the gloom. "What do you see?" whispered Valencia from the bottom of the incline. "Lights," he whispered back. "It's the Desaluta outpost, I think." "Desaluta? Have we come that far? If there are lights, maybe there are people." Since fleeing the agri-complex, they had found every town and homestead abandoned. Everyone seemed to have had the same thought as Tharo. Make for Salamas. Surely there would be some help at the hive. Surely someone would be in charge. But Tharo and Valencia were old. They could only move slowly. They needed a vehicle. Sorry about the abruptness in the moving, but I gotta flip a page and doing it with one hand because they wouldn't let me in. "Could be people," he said, wishing he had a pair of binoculars. "I don't think this place is on fire." She began to climb up to join him, then stopped, struggling to catch her breath and coughing. He reached down, helping her up. "Could it be them?" she asked, gripping his hand tightly. "The things in the dream?" He shook his head. His dreams were different to Valencia's. He saw a single huge monster with burn marks down one side of its head. It was coming to devour him, and each time he pictured it, whether he was asleep or awake, he had the sense that there were no escape. The giant would hunt him down. But Valencia dreamt of a host, a tide of smaller creatures, each no bigger than a human or a man, flooding through the darkness, swarming like insects, picking the flesh from everything they passed. "I think it's people," he said, trying to control his excitement. "Those lights look like they're coming from ground cars or maybe haulers, don't you think?" She nodded eagerly, still gripping his arm. "But what if they won't take us?" She coughed again. "What if they say have no room?" "They'll take us." Her cough made him determined. "Or we'll find a way to take one of the ground cars." She glanced at the shotgun he was holding in his other hand, her eyes wide in the darkness. "You're not..." She shook her head. "We don't know how to fight. If they were not friendly, we should just move on." He waved at the air. "This gas or dust or whatever it is killing us. I feel like I am breathing razors, and I can hear what it's doing to you. We have to head north. There must have been a fire or something," he said a few times now that the fumes must be from a fire, but neither of them really believed it. They both sensed that the poisoned air, the shapes falling from the sky, and the monsters in their dreams were all linked. All a part of an awful nightmare that they could not explain or wake up from. She looked unconvinced. If you try and use that thing on someone, they'll just turn it on you. You're no fighter. He said nothing. She was right, of course. He had never fired this thing in anger, but he might have no choice if people refused to help them. Every breath he took hurt more than the last, but that was not the worst thing. The worst thing was the sense of dread that grew in him every time he looked up. The end was close now. He could feel it. It had been coming for him since he had the first dream. Dragged from his bed, and now it was almost upon him. They had to get to the hive. He helped her up onto the transitway and began hurrying down, keeping the edge even though there was barely any light. He had a lumen in his bag, but he did not dare use it until he knew the people of Desaluta were friendly. As they came near, his hopes started to lift. They both heard the sound of the ground cars roaring around the outposts and indecipherable voices floating through the darkness. "They'll help us, I'm sure of it," he said, picking up his pace and pulling Valencia after him. She nodded back, her eyes glimmering with hope. Shots rang out in the distance, the harsh rattle of auto weapons. They froze. "That came from up ahead," he whispered at Valencia. She nodded. "Let's get closer," he said, pulling her on. She refused to move, shaking her head. "We have to go," he insisted. "It might be enforcers dealing with looters." She relented, letting him lead her on. They crawled down off the side of the road as they reached the outpost. Keeping away from the lights that spilled between the buildings as they edged closer, he saw that there were people in the small square between the structures. Some were seated in ground cars and trucks, while others paced between the silos and hab units. "Miners?" she whispered Valencia, frowning as she tried to make them out. "I don't think so," he replied, seeing that some of them were wearing tinted welding goggles and heavy overalls. "Why would they leave to come out here? Why leave the hive?" She stared at him, squeezing his arm. "Unless things are even worse at the hive. Maybe they came here because things are bad at Salamas too?" "No." He shook his head. He could not bear the idea that the vast metropolis like Salamas could have fallen into the same kind of anarchy that they had seen in the Agra complex. "That can't be right. I don't think this pollution could have spread too." More shots rang out. This close, the sound was jarringly loud, and he almost cried in shock. "Look," whispered Valencia. One of the miners dragged a corpse into view. It was a man. Blood was rushing from holes in his back. Someone cried out. It was horrible panic sound. Then they saw a woman sprinting from the buildings onto the transitway. She was running directly towards them. Another miner walked calmly out after her, raised a pistol and shot her, firing repeatedly until she lay still. Tharo felt Valencia stiffen at his side, and he understood why. As the miner walked over to the woman he had shot, they saw him more clearly. His face was terrifying. His skull was strangely elongated, like an egg lying on its side, and his brow was crossed by bony, rigid protrusions. But worst of all were his eyes. They were dark, featureless mirrors. Tharo clamped his hand over Valencia's mouth, sensing that she was about to scream. He felt like screaming himself when the half-man paused to look directly at him, staring into the darkness. Then the creature sniffed. Like a hound on a hunt, Valencia buried her face in his side, shivering with terror. Tharo held his breath and slowly resisted, his finger on the shotgun's trigger. Booming sounds rumbled in the distance as more of the shapes fell to earth. Tharo slowly raised the shotgun. Then the miner grabbed the dead woman and began hauling her back to the outpost. Tharo exhaled and removed his finger from the trigger. When the miner was back with the others, he finally dared to whisper, "Did you see that? We have to get out of here." Valencia's voice was trembling as they stared at the figures in the square. They dragged more dead bodies into view, dropping them in the heap. "Did you see it was sniffing? I swear it almost realized we were here. It could smell us, even in this bad air." He nodded and was about to head away from the transitway when he noticed something. Just outside the outpost, a dozen or so feet away, there was an empty ground car. It was a powerful-looking machine, the kind that rarely came to the agri-complex. "I can barely breathe," he whispered. "What about you?" She shook her head. "It's horrible. I feel like I'm breathing mud. But what difference does it make? We have to get away from those, whatever they are." She followed his gaze and saw the abandoned ground car. "No," she breathed. "Are you insane?" She yanked at his arm, but he refused to move. "They'll see you," she hissed, staring at him. "And they'll come over here." She closed her eyes. "What are they? How can they look like that? What's wrong with them?" "We would have a chance," he whispered. "If we had that ground car, we would have a chance to get out of here. If we just head off on foot, we're dead. Valencia, you know it. I can't breathe this stuff anymore. Another half mile, and we'll have to lie down in a ditch and wait for the carry-on birds to take us." "Rather that than face those things," she sobbed quietly, but she was no longer trying to pull him away. "It's our last chance. You know it, Val. I'm done. I can't walk anymore." She said nothing, but she nodded, then pressed her face against his chest. "I have an idea of how we could do it," he said, even though he sensed that there was no longer listening to him. "I could throw one of those rocks pretty far. I think I could throw one right over that fuel silo. It would make a pretty good noise." He realized how absurd it sounded, talking like he was some kind of hero, but he kept on regardless. "Then, when they head over there, we can crawl over to the ground car while they're all facing the other way. If it doesn't work, if we don't make it over there in time, we won't have lost anything. We could still just crawl away into the darkness. We'll keep looking for another outpost, I suppose, to see." His words trailed off as he realized he was talking nonsense. They both knew they would never reach another outpost. "Are you with me?" he whispered, picking up the rock. She still had her face buried in his chest. "Will you be ready to start crawling when I throw this?" She said nothing, but he felt her nod. He looked back at the miners. Now that he had seen one close up, he could tell how strange they were even at a distance. Their bulbous, distorted skulls reminded him of a monster in his dreams, and also their movements. There was something fitful and insect-like about the way they walked and carried their weapons. None of them were speaking, he realized, but they still moved in unison, as though answering silent commands. As they dragged more bodies onto the mound, "I can't do this," he realized, looking at the rock in his palm. His hand was shaking and there was sweat stinging his eyes and blurring his vision. "We will have to crawl away and die because I'm too much of a coward to try and live." Then he looked down at Valencia. She had lifted herself away from him, wiped the tears from her eyes, and was now staring at the ground car with a mixture of horror and determination. "She's not defeated yet," he realized. "Neither am I." He took a deep breath and leant back and hurled the rock as hard as he could. It arced high in the air and he sighed in relief, seeing that he had thrown the thing well. Then, as he looked at the outpost, he saw that none of the miners were watching the stone. They were all staring at him. "Run!" he gasped, hurling Valencia down the slope and breaking into a sprint, racing into the direction of the ground car. The half-men came after him in silence. Moving like automata, they spilled from the outpost, walking out into the muddy fields. They drew pistols and loaded shotguns. "Faster!" he cried, Darrow gripping Valencia's hand as he ran. Shot rang out. One whistled right past his face and kicked up mud at his feet, but he ignored it. There was no point in trying to weave and duck. All they could do was run and hope they reached the ground car. What if it's out of fuel? He thought it. The thought almost made him sick, but he ran on. There was nowhere else to go. Some of the half-men were now jogging, horribly silent, staring at him with dead, oily eyes. Pain exploded across his cheek and blood washed up over his face. Valencia screamed but kept on, pounding through the mud. "Halt!" cried out some of the miners, finally breaking their silence. The words sounded flat and lifeless in his mouth. as though he was repeating something he did not fully understand. Then, to Tharo's amazement, they had reached the ground car. They yanked the doors open and leapt inside. He cried out in relief as he saw the ignition crystals jutting from the control panel, but when he tried to start the engine, it only coughed and sputtered, refusing to turn over. Shot shattered the window, covering them in glittering shards and lacerating the side of Taro's face. More shots hit the side of the car, punching through the chassis and buckling the roll bars. Valencia grabbed something and crawled into the back seat. There was a deafening blast just behind his head, and then he realized she had taken the shotgun. Nearest of the half-men stumbled to a halt, looking down at a ragged hole in his chest. Then he tumbled into the mud. Valencia pumped the slide back and fired the shotgun again, hitting another miner in the chest and punching him back through the air. Tharo howled as he realized he had failed to open the ground car's fuel line. He flipped the switch and tried the crystals again. The engine roared to life. More shots rang out, and Valencia screamed, falling back in the seat. Tharo slammed his foot on the accelerator, and the ground car lurched forward, churning mud as it raced off across the field into the transitway. In the rearview mirror, the half-men lowered their weapons, watching them go, uninterested silence. Then they turned and headed back towards the outpost, dragging their dead with them as they went. "Valencia!" cried Tharo, straining to look over his shoulder. "Are you hurt?" She dragged herself up from the footwell onto the seat. Her face was gray and bloody, but she shook her head, eyes wide, patting the barrel of shotgun. "Perhaps I should carry this from now on." He laughed, almost hysterical with relief. "They missed you." She nodded, examining her overalls. "I think so." She stared at him in the mirror, her smile fading. "What were they?" He shook his head and kept his eyes on the transitway, trying not to look at the shapes rolling overhead. "We'll be safe when we reach Salamis. They'll know what to do." He tried to sound confident, but they could both hear the tremor in his voice.